The air in the Golden Nugget Saloon was a thick, breathing thing, heavy with the ghosts of stale cigar smoke and the sharp tang of spilled whiskey. It clung to Alara Vance's wool dress like a shroud. Sawdust, stained dark with mud and spirits, crunched under the worn heels of her boots as she shifted nervously on the stool. This was no place for a schoolteacher, and every instinct screamed at her to flee back to the quiet solitude of her one-room schoolhouse, with its scent of chalk dust and drying ink. But the schoolhouse roof had a hole the size of a dinner plate, and the autumn rains were coming. The town council had laughed her off, frivolous, they'd said, to spend money on education when there were fences to mend. So here she was, in the lion's den, her meager savings converted into a small, precarious stack of clay chips. Across the felt table, Jedediah Jed Stone watched her with the lazy contempt of a hawk observing a field mouse. As the son of the valley's wealthiest cattle baron, Jed had never known a day of want or a moment of doubt. His smile was a slash of white in his sun-browned face, and it held no warmth. To his left sat Silas, a grizzled prospector whose knuckles were as rough as the ore he dug from the hills, and to his right, a twitchy gambler they called Lefty, whose eyes never seemed to land on any one thing for more than a second. "Your bet, schoolmarm," Jed drawled, leaning back so his chair creaked in protest. The other men at the table chuckled into their glasses. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been playing cautiously, winning small pots, losing smaller ones, trying to build a foundation. But the pot in the middle of the table was now larger than anything she'd seen all night. It was enough. It was the roof. Her hand was strong, 3 queens, a formidable set. She had watched Jed's face, searching for a tell, a flicker of uncertainty, but found only smug confidence. This was her moment. She had to take it. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed her entire stack of chips into the center. "All in," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the saloon's low rumble like a breaking twig. The room quieted. Heads turned. This was more than a game now, it was a spectacle. Jed's smile widened. He didn't even hesitate. He casually tossed a few more chips in to cover her bet. "Brave words, Miss Vance. Let's see if you've got the cards to back 'em up." He laid his hand down with a theatrical flourish. 3 kings and 2 aces, a full house. An unbeatable hand. Alara stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The queens in her hand felt like a mockery. A cold wave of nausea washed over her as Jed's meaty hand swept the mountain of chips. Her savings, her hopes, the shingles for the schoolhouse roof, across the table toward his own pile. But the loss of the money was a dull ache compared to the sharp, piercing sting of what came next. Jed leaned forward, his voice booming for the whole saloon to hear. "And that, gentlemen, is what happens when a little songbird tries to run with the wolves. Stick to your ABCS, schoolmarm. This is a man's game." The laughter started with him, a deep, cruel bellow that shook his shoulders. It spread like a virus. Silas guffawed, slapping his knee. Lefty let out a high-pitched cackle. Soon, the entire saloon seemed to be roaring, the sound crashing down on Alara, wave after wave. Her face burned with a heat so intense she thought she might combust. Each laugh was a physical blow, stripping away her dignity, her composure, her very sense of self. She was a fool, a public joke. Scrabbling back from the table, she nearly tripped over her stool. She fled to the darkest corner of the saloon, pressing herself against the rough-hewn wall, wishing the shadows would swallow her whole. The laughter eventually subsided, replaced by the normal din, but it echoed relentlessly in her ears. Through the haze of her shame, a snippet of conversation from 2 men at a nearby table cut through. "Stone's getting bold," one grumbled. "He'd better watch his step. Sheriff Beaumont's due back on the morning stage, and he don't take kindly to that kind of sport." The laughter followed Alara out of the swinging doors of the Golden Nugget, a phantom chorus that clung to her like the fine red dust of Redemption streets. She didn't run. Running would have been a concession, another performance for the crowd inside. Instead, she walked with a brittle, measured pace, her back straight, each step a monumental effort against the crushing weight of her shame. The cool night air, thick with the scent of sagebrush and distant cattle, offered no comfort. It felt suffocating, each breath a painful reminder of her folly. She didn't go back to her small room at the boarding house. The thought of facing the landlady's prying eyes in the morning was unbearable. There was only one place to go, the monument to her failure. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a dark, slumped silhouette against a sky littered with indifferent stars. The splintered door groaned in protest as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the cavernous, empty room. Inside, the moonlight slanted through the gaping holes in the roof, illuminating patches of the warped wooden floor like spotlights on a stage of disgrace. This was why she had done it. For the children who squinted in the dim light, for the books that were slowly being ruined by the occasional leak. She walked to her simple pine desk and ran her hand over its surface, the wood smooth from years of use. Her savings were gone, the roof would remain broken, and her reputation, the only real currency a schoolteacher possessed, was in tatters. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips, the first sound she had made since leaving the saloon. She sank into her chair, laid her head on the desk, and let the silence of her failure consume her. The next morning, the sun rose with a brutal, unforgiving glare, baking the dust of the main street into a hard-crusted pan. A lone rider approached from the west, his silhouette steady and unwavering in the shimmering heat. This was not a man who rushed. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, moved with an easy, ground-eating gait. The man in the saddle was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, dark clothing devoid of any flashy embroidery. A worn leather gun belt sat low on his hips, the pistol it held looking more like a tool than an ornament. His face, shaded by the brim of his hat, was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of long hours under the Arizona sun and a life that demanded watchfulness. His eyes, when he finally looked up at the town sign, were a startlingly clear gray, missing nothing. Sheriff Caleb Beaumont dismounted in front of the livery, handing the reins to the stable boy with a quiet nod of thanks. He didn't have to announce his return. A ripple of awareness spread through the town on its own. Windows were peeked through, conversations on porches dropped to a murmur. Beaumont's presence was an event. He walked with a purpose that made people step aside, his gaze sweeping over the town, cataloging the subtle changes since he'd been gone. His first stop was the Golden Nugget. The saloon was quiet, smelling of stale beer and regret. Silas, the bartender, was polishing glasses, his movements methodical. He paused when he saw the sheriff, his professional smile tightening slightly. "Sheriff, back already?" Silas asked, placing a clean glass on the counter. "Seemed about time," Beaumont replied, his voice a low baritone that carried easily in the quiet room. He didn't take a stool, preferring to stand. "Coffee, Silas." Silas poured a mug of the thick, black liquid. "Anything I should know about?" Beaumont took a slow sip, his gray eyes fixed on the bartender. He let the silence stretch, a familiar tactic. He knew that in a town like Redemption, silence was often filled with the truth. Finally, Silas shifted his weight. Just the usual. A few hands from the Stone Ranch got a little rowdy Saturday. Nothing major. He hesitated, then added, "Jed was holding a big game last night. Cleaned out a few folks." "Anyone I know?" Beaumont asked, his tone deceptively casual. Silas looked down, busying himself by wiping a clean spot on the bar. "The new schoolteacher, Miss Vance, she tried her luck. Didn't go well for her." The bartender's voice was carefully neutral, but Beaumont heard the undercurrent of pity and something else, disapproval. He knew Jed Stone's particular brand of cruelty. It wasn't just about winning, it was about breaking his opponent. Beaumont finished his coffee and placed the empty mug on the counter with a quiet click. "I see." He said nothing more, turning to leave. As he stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, his expression was unreadable, but a grim line had settled around his mouth. The town had a broken schoolhouse, and now, it seemed, it had a broken schoolteacher, too. And both problems had the same name attached to them: Stone. The knock on the schoolhouse door was so firm and unexpected it made Alara jump, scattering a small pile of mended textbooks across her desk. She'd spent the morning in a fog of self-recrimination, trying to impose order on the chaos of the classroom as a way to avoid the greater chaos in her own mind. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, illuminating the water stains on the ceiling, a stark, physical reminder of her failure. She smoothed her dress, took a steadying breath, and opened the door. Sheriff Caleb Beaumont stood on the worn wooden step, his tall frame seeming to block out the sun. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stoic stone as the surrounding mesas, but his eyes, a sharp, clear gray, missed nothing. They took in the disarray of her desk, the weariness etched around her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that carried no judgment. "Sheriff Beaumont, mind if I come in? Wanted to take a look at the damage to the roof you've been concerned about." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but Alara felt her cheeks flush with heat. The whole town knew why she was so concerned about the roof. She stepped aside, murmuring, "Of course, Sheriff, please come in." He moved with a quiet economy, his worn leather boots making little sound on the dusty floorboards. He didn't look at her, instead tilting his head back to survey the ceiling. "It's worse in this corner," he observed, pointing toward the area above her desk. "That beam looks like it's starting to soften." "Yes," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "When it rains, I have to move all the books." He nodded slowly, his gaze finally settling on her. "Heard you took a personal interest in trying to fix the problem." The statement was neutral, but it landed like an accusation. Alara's shoulders tensed. "I was imprudent, Sheriff. I won't make the same mistake again." "Mistakes happen, ma'am," he said, his expression unchanging. "It's how a person stands up after they've been knocked down that shows their character." Before she could process the unexpected sliver of grace in his words, the sound of an approaching horse and a loud, boastful laugh shattered the quiet. Jed Stone reined his magnificent black stallion to a halt just outside the schoolhouse, dismounting with a theatrical flourish. He sauntered to the doorway, his silver belt buckle glinting, a smirk plastered on his face. Well, look what we have here," he drawled, his eyes flicking from Alara to the sheriff. "Teacher, sheriff, having a lesson on local laws." He leaned against the doorframe, deliberately crowding the entrance. "Or perhaps you're explaining why a good little schoolmarm shouldn't play a man's game." Alara flinched as if struck. The humiliation from the saloon came rushing back, hot and suffocating. She felt small, exposed, all over again. Sheriff Beaumont didn't raise his voice. He didn't move a muscle. He simply turned his head, and the full weight of his quiet authority fell on Jed Stone. The air in the small room grew thick and heavy. "Mr. Stone," Beaumont said, his voice dropping an octave, now laced with steel, "I believe Miss Vance is occupied, and I'm conducting official town business regarding the safety of this structure." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Find somewhere else to be." It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal as absolute as a locked door. Jed's smirk faltered. He tried to hold the sheriff's gaze, but was the first to look away, his bravado evaporating under that unblinking stare. He mumbled something under his breath, shot a final, venomous look at Alara, and turned on his heel. The sound of his horse galloping away was a welcome release. Silence descended once more, but it was a different kind of silence. The tension was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Alara looked at the sheriff, who was already back to examining the water-stained ceiling as if nothing had happened. "I know a man, name of Silas," Beaumont said quietly. "He's a good carpenter. I'll ask him to come by, take a look at that beam, see if he can't patch the worst of it for the time being." He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." And with that, he was gone, leaving Alara standing alone in the dusty sunlight, the echo of his quiet support, a more powerful defense than any wall she could have built. The dust from Sheriff Beaumont's horse had barely settled when Alara heard the telltale rattle of a wagon approaching. She stood frozen in the doorway of the schoolhouse, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She expected Jed Stone to return, perhaps with his father in tow, to escalate his campaign of humiliation. Instead, a rickety buckboard wagon, laden with tools, shingles, and weathered lumber, pulled to a stop. A man with a fringe of gray hair, a kind, wrinkled face, and hands as gnarled as old oak roots hopped down. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly but gentle rumble. "Name's Silas. Sheriff sent me. Said you had a roof in need of some pursuit-in." He tipped his hat, his eyes crinkling in a friendly smile that immediately eased the tension in Alara's shoulders. This was real. The sheriff hadn't just been placating her, he had acted. "Mr. Silas," Alara breathed, a wave of relief so potent it nearly buckled her knees. "Yes, please come in." Silas didn't waste any time. He clambered onto the roof with a surprising agility, his hammer taps soon echoing through the quiet afternoon. Down below, Alara felt a strange new energy coursing through her. For 2 days, the schoolhouse had been her prison, a monument to her failure. Now, with each rhythmic strike from above, it felt like a home being reclaimed. The sound wasn't just a hammer hitting nails. It was the sound of progress, of a promise kept. An hour later, Silas climbed down for a drink of water from the canteen Alara offered. He wiped his brow with the back of a dusty sleeve. "Sheriff was right. This whole section is rotten through. But I can patch it up to see you through the next few storms. It'll hold." He took a long drink, then looked at her with a knowing, sympathetic gaze. "Word travels fast in redemption, Miss Vance, especially when it involves Jedstone getting his tail feathers clipped." Alara's cheeks flushed. I didn't mean for any trouble." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You didn't cause it. That boy has been a burr under this town's saddle for years. Folks are just glad someone finally had the sand to pull it out. And common from Sheriff Beaumont, well, that carries more weight than gold." He leaned a little closer, his voice dropping. "The talk in town ain't about the schoolteacher who lost at poker. It's about the arrogant fool who forgot who runs this town. The sheriff put him in his place without even drawing a breath, they're saying. You did this community a service, ma'am, even if it wasn't your intention." His words were a balm on her wounded pride. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud began to feel lighter, less suffocating. She wasn't the town joke. She was the catalyst for a long overdue reckoning, a flicker of her old self, the determined teacher who had traveled across the country for this post, ignited within her. She looked around the dusty, neglected interior of the schoolhouse. The desks were coated in grime, a stack of water-damaged primers sat molding in a corner, and a thick film of red dust covered everything. It was a reflection of how she'd felt, abandoned and decaying. But now, with the hammering above and Silas's words echoing in her ears, she saw not an impossible mess, but a project. Leaving Silas to his work, Alara found a broom and began to sweep. The simple, repetitive motion was grounding. With every cloud of dust she pushed out the door, she felt like she was clearing away the last vestiges of her humiliation. She moved to the corner and carefully picked up the damaged books. Most were beyond saving, but she found a half-dozen that were salvageable. She wiped each one down, her fingers tracing the faded letters on their covers. She found a sturdy crate, turned it on its side, and arranged the books neatly, creating the school's first tiny library. It was a small, almost insignificant act, but it felt monumental. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, illuminating the clean patch of floor and the row of restored books, Alara Vance wasn't just a broken gambler anymore. She was a teacher, building her school. The sound of Silas's hammer had been replaced by a different kind of rhythm, the steady swoosh of Alara's broom against the dusty floorboards. The patch on the roof, a dark, sturdy square against the weathered shingles, was more than just a temporary fix. It was a shield against the rain and a beacon against the despair that had soaked her to the bone. With every stroke of the broom, she swept away not just dirt, but the lingering shadows of humiliation. The classroom was slowly transforming. Books were stacked, desks were arranged, and a small vase with a single, resilient desert wildflower sat on her desk. Her purpose, once a flickering candle flame, now burned with a steady warmth. The roof was a major problem, but Silas's help had shown her it wasn't insurmountable. Waiting for the sheriff or some other powerful figure to solve everything wasn't the answer. She had to act. An idea began to form, a simple, wholesome plan that felt right for a schoolteacher: a town bake sale. It wouldn't just raise money, it would bring people together for a common good, weaving a stronger fabric for the community she now called home. She first approached Martha, the formidable owner of the Golden Nugget. Leaning against the polished bar in the quiet afternoon hours, Alara laid out her plan. Martha listened, her expression unreadable, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It's a good idea, teacher," she said, her voice a low rumble. "People round here respect effort. You'll get some help." She was right. A few mothers, initially hesitant, warmed to the idea when they saw Alara's earnest determination. The plan was set for Saturday, in the small square outside the schoolhouse. Word travels fast in a town like Redemption, and it didn't take long to reach Jed Stone. He was nursing a whiskey and a bruised ego in the corner of the saloon when he overheard two ranch hands talking about the teacher's bake sale. The public dressing down from Sheriff Beaumont had made him a town spectacle. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a simmering rage. He couldn't go after Beaumont, and confronting Alara directly would only make him look like more of a bully. But he could still squeeze. He could still remind everyone who held the real power in this town. The next day, when Mrs. Gable went to Henderson's general store for flour and sugar, she was met with a shrug. "Sorry, ma'am," Mr. Henderson said, avoiding her eyes. "Big shipment's been delayed. Ain't got much of either." Another woman was told the price of butter had mysteriously doubled overnight. It was a subtle, insidious campaign. Jed had paid a visit to Henderson, whose business depended on credit from the Stone cattle empire. The message was clear: make things difficult for the schoolteacher and anyone who helps her. Doubt began to creep into the town's enthusiasm. Whispers of the sudden shortages spread, and the initial wave of support began to ebb. It was one thing to feel sympathy for the teacher. It was another to cross the stones. Alara felt her own confidence waver as two mothers regretfully backed out, citing their empty pantries. For a moment, the old shame threatened to return. Jed was winning again, not with a winning hand of cards, but with the quiet, crushing weight of his family's influence. She sat on the schoolhouse steps, the vibrant desert sunset mocking her faltering hope. Just as she was about to surrender, a shadow fell over her. It was Sila's, his hammer looped through his belt. "Heard you're having some supply trouble," he said, his voice steady. Alara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Henderson's is convenient, but it ain't the only source," Sila's continued, a knowing look in his eye. "My cousin has a small mill 10 miles out. I reckon he'd have some flour for a good cause. And Martha over at the saloon, she keeps a stash of sugar for her special concoctions. I think she might be persuaded to share." A small flicker of hope ignited within her. Before she could even respond, Mrs. Gable appeared, holding a basket. "It's not much, Alara," she said, her voice firm with defiance. "But I have eggs from my chickens, and a jar of preserves my sister sent from back east. We'll make it work." Soon, another woman arrived with a crock of butter she'd churned herself. One by one, they came not with apologies, but with offerings. They were pooling their resources, a quiet but powerful act of rebellion against Jed Stone's unseen hand. The bake sale was no longer just about fixing a roof. It had become a stand. Looking at the determined faces of her new allies, Alara Vance realized she wasn't just the town's schoolteacher anymore. She was part of Redemption, and they wouldn't let her fight alone. The morning of the bake sale broke clear and bright, the Arizona sun casting long shadows across Redemption's main street. A palpable energy, a mix of nervous excitement and stubborn defiance, hung in the air. In front of the schoolhouse, a patchwork of tables had been set up, draped in mismatched but clean cloths. The air, usually thick with dust and the scent of horses, was now rich with the aroma of cinnamon, baked apples, and fresh bread. Women from all corners of the town, who had pooled their last cups of sugar and flour, arranged their offerings with pride. Alara moved between them, a quiet leader coordinating the final touches. She was no longer the timid woman who had fled the Golden Nugget in shame. Dressed in a simple but practical dress, her hair tied back, There was a new resolve in her eyes. She felt a profound sense of belonging, a connection forged in shared adversity. The bake sale was more than a fundraiser. It was the town drawing a line in the sand. Sales started briskly. Miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers, many of whom had witnessed her humiliation, came not just for a slice of pie, but to make a statement. Coins clinked into the collection jar, each one a small vote of confidence. Just as the midday sun reached its peak, a shadow fell over the cheerful scene. Jed Stone, flanked by two of his usual cronies, swaggered toward them. The laughter and chatter died down, replaced by a tense silence. He stopped before the main table, a sneer twisting his lips as he surveyed the humble offerings. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at this pathetic little charity, trying to fix a roof with crumbs and sugar. Redemption's really hit rock bottom." Mrs. Gable, a woman in her 60s with hands gnarled from decades of work, straightened her back. "These crumbs were made with honest hands, Jed. Something you wouldn't know anything about." Jed's sneer tightened. He picked up a small oatmeal cookie, examined it with theatrical disgust, and crumbled it in his fist, letting the pieces fall into the dust. Honest and worthless. He took a step closer to Alara, his presence looming and aggressive. "You really think this changes anything, schoolteacher? You're still a nobody here." "A joke." Alara met his gaze, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "We're not a joke, Mr. Stone. We're a community. And we're taking care of our own." Enraged by her calm defiance, Jed's pretense of mockery vanished. He lunged forward, not at Alara, but at the table next to her, shoving it hard. Pies and cakes tumbled to the ground, smashing in the dirt. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Silas, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, his fists clenching. But he didn't have to. "That's enough, Stone." The voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it cut through the tension like a razor. Sheriff Caleb Beaumont stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable, his hand resting casually near his hip. He hadn't been seen, but he had clearly been watching. He walked forward slowly, his gaze locked on Jed, forcing him and his friends to take a step back. "Just having a little fun, Sheriff," Jed stammered, his bravado instantly evaporating. "Your fun is over," Beaumont said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "You're disturbing the peace, and you're harassing these citizens." He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a threat, he simply stated facts. He stopped directly in front of Jed. "Now, you and your friends are going to leave, and you won't be coming back." Jed's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. To be dressed down in front of the entire town, for a second time, was more than he could bear. He shot a venomous glare at Alara before turning on his heel and stomping away, his cronies scrambling after him. A moment of stunned silence hung in the air, and then the tension broke. A few people began to clap, and soon the entire crowd joined in. The bake sale resumed with a renewed fire. People bought the remaining goods, and many simply pressed bills into Alara's hands, their donations far exceeding the cost of any pastry. By the end of the day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Alara and Mrs. Gable counted the money. They hadn't just made enough for temporary repairs. They had more than half of what they needed for a new roof. Alara looked up, her eyes misty with gratitude, and saw the sheriff watching from across the street. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning and continuing his patrol. A silent guardian of a town that was finally learning to stand together. The last of the lanterns in Redemption had been extinguished, leaving the town under a blanket of brilliant desert stars. Inside the schoolhouse, Alara sat at her desk, the faint scent of cinnamon and sugar still clinging to the air. In a small metal box before her was the fruit of their labor, a sum that would not only repair the roof, but also buy new books and slates. A quiet, profound joy settled in her heart. She hadn't just raised money. She had found a home. A sudden, sharp crack from outside shattered the peace. Alara froze, her hand hovering over the cash box. Another sound followed, the splintering of wood. Her blood ran cold. Setting the lantern to a low flicker, she crept to the window and peered into the darkness. A shadowy figure was prying boards from the schoolhouse wall. Then, he struck a match. In the brief, flaring light, she saw Jed Stone's face, twisted with a desperate, destructive rage. In his other hand, he held a can of kerosene. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to grip her, but it found no purchase. It was replaced by a wave of protective anger. This was her school, her town. She swung the door open, the lantern held high. "Jed, stop!" Her voice didn't tremble. It was clear and strong, echoing in the night. He spun around, startled, the match dropping from his fingers and sizzling out in the dust. "You," he snarled, his eyes wild. "You think you won? You and this whole worthless town? My family built redemption. I'll burn it down before I let a nobody like you humiliate me." He lunged for the can, but Alara was faster, kicking it away. It rolled into the shadows with a hollow clang. He advanced on her, his hands clenched into fists. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, backing her toward the doorway. "That's enough, son." The voice was low, calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. Sheriff Caleb Beaumont stepped out of the darkness, his silhouette framed by the starlight. He hadn't drawn his weapon, he didn't need to. His presence was enough. Jed froze, his face draining of color. "Sheriff, You were just about to commit arson, Jed," Beaumont finished, his eyes hard as flint. "After vandalism and witness intimidation. It's been a busy few days for you." From the main road, the sound of an approaching carriage grew louder. It stopped abruptly, and a portly, well-dressed man stepped down, Jed's father, Elias Stone. "Beaumont, what is the meaning of this?" Elias boomed, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "Release my son at once." The sheriff didn't even turn to look at him. His gaze remained locked on Jed. "Elias, your son was attempting to burn down the schoolhouse. Miss Vance is the witness." Elias Stone scoffed. "Nonsense. A misunderstanding. The boy was angry. We'll pay for any damages." "This isn't about money anymore," Beaumont said, finally turning to face the older man. He moved with deliberate calm, producing a pair of handcuffs. "It's about the law, and in this town, the law applies to everyone." He snapped the cuffs onto a stunned Jed's wrists. For the first time, Elias Stone was speechless, his face a mask of disbelief as his power crumbled before his eyes. The sheriff led a defeated Jed away, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path, leaving Alara standing in the quiet victory of the night. Weeks later, the Arizona sun shone down on a new, sturdy roof. The sound of children reciting their letters drifted from the open windows of the Redemption Schoolhouse. Inside, Alara moved between the rows of students, a genuine smile gracing her lips. The town had truly healed. With the Stone family's influence broken, a new sense of fairness had settled over the community. As the children were dismissed for the day, their laughter filling the yard, Sheriff Beaumont stopped by, leaning against the doorframe. "Looks solid, Miss Vance," he said, nodding toward the ceiling. "It is, Sheriff," she replied, her gaze meeting his. "Thanks to you, to everyone." He gave a slight, respectful tip of his hat. "You did the hard work. You gave them something to believe in." He turned to leave, but Alara's voice stopped him. "Sheriff, I never thought I'd find my voice again here." He looked back, a rare, small smile touching his lips. Some songs are just too important not to be sung. As he walked away, Alara Vance stood in her classroom, bathed in the warm afternoon light, finally and truly at peace. She was home.